Bueno, pues...
Okay, so good afternoon and welcome. It's a great pleasure to see you all here. It's an event that is very interesting, I think. That is part of the cycle Imagining the Future by Fundación Telefónica because of its 100th anniversary. So we have with us Carl Chayka. Is the author of The Filter World, How Algorithms Are Flattening the Culture. Carl's a journalist and a cultural criticist. He lives in Washington. He's part of the New Yorker stuff, and he has worked for other media like New York Times or Magazine, The Verge or Harper's. His first essay, To Wish Less, is about minimalism that is highly advisable, and I also recommend his newsletter. His newsletter is very good. You need to subscribe to it. So in Filter World, what Carl has done is to speak about how digital culture that has been imposed by the big platforms of social media shapes our material reality. We tend to think that the internet is a different space to real world, but sometimes what happens on the internet is shaping the real world. So the best example is the algorithm. The algorithm is a term that we all use, but not everybody understands. Carl explains on his book that on itself the word algorithm makes a reference to an equation. But we all know what we are talking about when we speak about the Netflix algorithm. And we intuitively, when we use this term, we are speaking about two things: an absence of healing, of human component, and some kind of homogeneity. This is why the term that he has invented is the filter world to become this algorithm reality to define our experience in social media. But the algorithm recommendations have become into a great force where there used to be artists, creators, DJs or editors. Now we have that type of for you and the suggestions, the recommendations or the self-generated recommendations. So as a consequence, everything tends to be the same, tends to flatten, because this is what we're looking for. And maybe we could get started by speaking about the first time that you perceived that word, that filter world exists. It was in 2015, and was it a cafeteria, right?
Yes, it was at a coffee shop. So I think in 2015, 2016, as I was traveling around the world, being a journalist, kind of writing stories in different countries, I noticed that whichever city I landed in, I could always find a particular kind of cafe that looked exactly the same. So it had this same kind of globalized, homogenous aesthetic that I think you can recognize in Spain and in anywhere you go. There's white subway tile on the walls, there's succulent plants in small ceramic planters, there's cappuccinos with latte art, there's hanging Edison bulbs from the ceiling, and it just struck me that there wasn't a corporation that demanded all of these coffee shops look the same. It wasn't like a Starbucks or a Costa Coffee or something. It kind of organically happened that all of these independent cafes drifted toward the same aesthetic. And at the time, I had an inkling or an idea that it was connected to social media, but it took, the next 5 or 8 years as I thought about this book to really confirm the theory that why that was happening, why the cafes were generic, was because all of these baristas and cafe owners and restaurant designers were connected by social media. Because of Instagram, because we're all suddenly moving through this same digital platform, I think our tastes are becoming gradually more similar than different, and the popular aesthetics are becoming more similar than different.
Mm-hmm. Es interesante porque...
It's interesting because this cafeteria, what we do is, to take the same picture of the cappuccino as everybody uploads to the Instagram. We'll listen to the same song on TikTok. So cafeterias are a place where everything happens, but these homogeneous cafeterias, the shape and, everything that we do there, it's like painted walls or lift music. What we do inside is like more or less we are doing all the same, right? It's like it blends.
Yeah, I think the cafes are this aesthetic environment that it's particularly immersive. Like, coffee shops are a kind of space that you can find anywhere you go. There are certain habits that you can follow anywhere you go. And I think, why they're such a great example in this case is because they're already very cosmopolitan. They're like globalized spaces. And they're ways that we demonstrate our sense of taste. Like we show our taste and we show our aesthetics and our style by ordering a particular kind of coffee. Like, now you can get a cortado anywhere. Yeah. You can order your avocado toast anywhere. And it was interesting this time. I've been to Spain for quite a few years now, and this is the first time I've noticed so many cortados and avocado toasts listed at cafes. So it's very interesting to see. I think these are like symbols of taste. It's a way that we connect with each other and kind of show our belonging in some kind of community. But I think the community that we're showing belonging in is an online community. like by ordering the cortado, by going to the white subway tile walled cafe, we're showing that we understand the aesthetics of the internet and we appreciate the aesthetics of the internet. And those aren't so connected to the geographical place that we're in. Mm-hmm. Like, I think, I don't know, it's, when I'm in one of these coffee shops, I feel like I'm more in Instagram than I am in the city itself.
Es curioso.
It's amazing because it's a real globalization. I mean, globalization has become real thanks to how much technology has progressed, right?
I think globalization has always existed. Like, there's examples of sameness going back to the Roman Empire. Like, they built the same marble temples and bathhouses everywhere. But I think globalization has really accelerated over the past decade or two because of the internet. And I think the difference now is that it's happening on this very granular, personal level. So, in the 90s or 2000s, when we talked about globalization, I feel like it was often the example of McDonald's. Yeah. McDonald's is in China, the world is globalized. But now it's not just corporations popping up in every country, but our personal preferences and tastes are being shaped on a global level. So I think with the rise of Instagram and of multimedia, social media, I can consume content made by any individual person in any country where this platform exists instantaneously when they post it. So I think in the book, I interviewed a bunch of cafe owners who designed their places specifically in this generic aesthetic, and I asked them, why did you do this? Like, what motivated you to design it this way? And what they said was they felt pressure to fit in with Instagram, to make a space that would appeal to that demographic and kind of work in that context. And that context really only emerged in 2012, 2013. So it's a pretty recent phenomenon.
En el libro...
So in the book you speak a lot about taste and about the process of creating your own personal taste. Now in filter world, that could be at risk of disappearing, because what the algorithm does is to foster what many people like, so to speak, and it replicates it as similar as possible. So if everything is the same, if the whole culture that we consume tends to homogenize, where do we have that creation of our personal taste?
Yeah, I think personal taste has gone away a little bit, or it's harder to follow your own personal taste. I think I talked to a few people in the book who almost mourned their sense of taste. They felt like because they were so attached to the TikTok For You feed, they had lost touch with what they actually liked. And I think, that's a bad thing. I think personal taste is what makes us individual and what gives us our sense of enjoyment of culture and of finding meaning in different things. So I hope, I think it's not that personal taste is gone. Like, we always have the opportunity to seek something out, to go off the beaten path of the algorithm. But I think it's harder to do, and there's just more distractions moving away from it.
Muchas veces
Many times we tend to think of algorithms as an invisible god that is everywhere. And in some way, it has been created by the machine, right? Your book starts speaking about the mechanic turkey that was a robot that lied to people, a Turk, sorry, by saying, well, it was able to cheat on people. So algorithms have been created by people. Why are they so good when dressing up as something automated? And we tend to lose that perspective, and we forget that we have created them.
I think algorithms have this way of manipulating you or fooling you. There's what you interact with in a feed or in a social network is just that endpoint of recommendation. Like, you see the next video in your TikTok feed or the next post on Instagram, and you think that is the extent of the algorithm. It's something that's just giving you a piece of content. But I think what it hides is a kind of series of machines like the mechanical Turk. Like, if the recommendation is just the arm moving on the chessboard, then there's a lot happening behind the scenes. And on one level, that's the collection of data. Like, we're being surveilled. Every action that we take on the internet or off, like moving around with our phones, is collected and then crunched and thrown in with everyone else's data on that platform. And then all of that is used to drive that one action of the recommendation. And I think we also forget that ultimately algorithms are machines that are controlled by other humans. Like, we do think of the algorithm as this invisible god, like a deity that we can't control and works in unknowable ways, and is somehow like a permanent fact of our society, when actually it's not. Like, these products are the creation of Silicon Valley CEOs and engineers, and they decide on a week-to-week and month-to-month basis how they work. So I think it's good to remember that the system can always change, and it's not inevitable in any way. Like, we can shut these things off or make them work differently than they do.
De todos modos.
Anyway, right now, we are in that paradigm, and we are not being able to turn them off. It had never happened at such a scale as it is happening now, that the way we distribute content is the one who sets the parameters of this content. TikTok is a great example. TikTok creates songs, creates music trends, and trends in general, and at the same time is the way these trends are distributed.
I think the fact is that the distribution mechanism shapes the culture. And I think that's always been true. Like, you have the famous Marshall McLuhan quote, "The medium is the message." But in his time, he was talking about cable television. now we've gone far beyond that. And I think something that's happened over the past decade is that these digital platforms have really taken over specific mediums of culture. So TikTok has taken over how music is distributed. Instagram has taken over how visual art and imagery is distributed. And I think they really do force particular templates on those genres of culture. So I think we really see the effects of TikTok on pop music, which is really dense and fast and tries to grab your attention immediately and hit you over the head with whatever the hook is in the first 10 seconds, in the hope that 10 seconds will be put on TikTok and repeated by everyone else and become an auditory meme, basically. So I think the scope of culture, like the ways that culture can exist right now, are really limited by the platforms that they flow through. And at the same time, we're also at fault as users or as the audience in a way, because we allow our attention to be so concentrated on those platforms. Like in my case, I use Spotify every day. Despite writing a book that's critical of algorithms, I'm still following playlists and having it, keep playing jazz soundtracks for me endlessly. That might be bad for my personal tastes, but I still do it, and I should devote my attention to something better, I suppose.
Hablando de Spotify.
So speaking about Spotify, besides this trend to uniformity that is fostered by the algorithm, it's also finishing with our capacity with our attention capacity. I mean, the button to move on to the next song, that was something that did not exist with LPs, with records, as traditionally we used to consume it, doesn't only make us less receptive or less keen on giving a chance to a song that maybe we don't like during the first seconds, but it's also changing the way songs are composed, because now the industry knows that you need to concentrate the good things in those first 15 seconds. So this is why so many songs are so short, and they start directly with the chorus. So it's like they are leading the charge.
Yeah, I think the user interaction shapes the culture too. Like, it's not just the algorithmic recommendation, it's literally where the buttons are and how we interact with the whatever content is on the screen. So in the case of Spotify, there's always that button to hit the next track. You can always skip to the next thing. And on TikTok, it's even easier. Like, all you have to do is flip your thumb up and the next thing comes up. And so I think it's so easy to do that. It's so convenient to just get bored for 1 microsecond and skip. And I think we give in to that a lot. So it leads to this impatience with culture. It leads to us not giving things a chance to unfold or contemplating a thing for any length of time. When I think there was some statistic that the average visitor to the Museum of Modern Art looks at a single painting for like 8 seconds. And I mean, that almost seems long by TikTok standards.
Yeah.
Like, the 2 seconds is long. So I think our attention spans are getting worse and worse, but because of the software itself, because we're given so many other options, we give in to our boredom really quickly. Like, I sometimes compare it to dating. Like, on Tinder, there's always a million other options on there, and you just flip through all the options. So what is I guess it's a bad metaphor, but I would hope people would settle down with a song or a painting and like spend a long time with it. But instead, it's just on to the next thing.
Yeah. A veces los algoritmos.
Sometimes the algorithms and filter world create quite curious situations. You tell the story of a music band that somehow one of the most atypical songs, maybe the most atypical song, was the one that was the most reproduced and the most played, and they didn't understand why.
Right, so this was a band from, I think, the late 80s, and one of the band members had kind of kept control of the music and was organizing the streaming rights. So he knew that the songs were on Spotify, and he kind of watched what was happening through the streaming data. And he realized that this one track was suddenly getting more and more listens, like, 10 times more than the other tracks. And the only thing that had changed was that Spotify had started using more aggressive algorithmic recommendations. So the playlists were, when you let a song stop, it immediately went to a recommendation. And so that's the moment when the song started to blow up. And what he gradually realized was that that particular song sounded the most normal in a way. Like, he discussed this with a Spotify executive, and they discovered that that song sounded the most like the music of other bands. So it was a really good song for the algorithmic recommendation to recommend, because people would be unlikely to skip it. It's because it sounded normal. It sounded pleasant and average. And yet what I found so striking about that was, for the band, that song's normalness was ironic. Like, they were ironically making a normal sounding song. But if you separate that song from the context of their other work, from the album, then you're never going to know it's ironic.
Yeah.
It points to how in digital platforms or in streaming services, the intention of the artist is often lost. Like you don't know what someone means by something because you can't see the other work that they've surrounded it by. I think fundamentally it's like a matter of decontextualization. Everything is aggressively decontextualized, and culture relies on context. Like if we don't know the context of something, how can we truly understand it?
Y no solo la intención de...
Not only the artist's intention, sometimes the curator's intention. You speak about this figure, the curation. For example, an algorithm, when it creates a song list, it just compiles one after the other. But if you create a playlist, there's an internal structure. I mean, you are not putting one song after the other, but you are creating an atmosphere, and the songs are following a special order, so to speak, because a human being has done so. This is something that a human curator has, and the algorithm will never have that.
Yeah, I think so. What the algorithm doesn't have is personal taste. Like I think, I often think about how the algorithm can't enjoy a song. There's all the algorithm can do is take the data that exists, whether from you or other users, and use that data to dictate what it recommends. There's no creative enjoyment of a piece of culture. There's no emotion or feeling there, and so the order that things are put in is just driven by the data that the algorithm has. Whereas I think a human curator arranges things according to their own taste and is communicating some fundamental message through how they arrange things. And that's true of a playlist on Spotify. It's true of a mixtape. It's also true of a museum exhibition in terms of which paintings are next to which other paintings. The human curator has a goal and a thing to communicate with how they arrange things. The algorithm has no message. There's no curation of a theme. There's no critical argument about how things connect together. There's just, unfeeling data. And that seems like a loss to me. We get so much meaning out of how things are arranged, and streaming services and digital platforms have basically taken that arrangement away from us.
En el libro...
So in the book you reflect upon the evolution that Facebook has had since it started at a place to say happy birthday to your friends until what it has become right now. All the process throughout all these years, do you think that it would be like the best role model to explain someone what filter world is? I mean, that evolution that Facebook has had since when it started until what it has become into now?
Yeah, Facebook... it's still the most popular overall social network, I think. I think it has the most users of any social network. And I think it really formed what people's idea of social media was. Facebook was the first social media that I really had and that I really moved my life onto. And it really did change over the course of the 2010s. I think it's really clear how, or even from its founding and original first few years in 2004 to 6, originally it was only for Harvard students, and then it was for all Ivy League university students, and then it was for all university students, and only slowly did it become for everyone on earth. It didn't start out
and there your mother was there too.
Yeah, exactly. But as it grew, it changed. As more and more people were posting at the same time, as they packed more content types into Facebook, they needed a way to filter it. In the early years, that feed was linear or chronological, so just a list of posts from oldest to newest. But I think that became untenable when there was just too much to look at. So the function of the algorithmic recommendation is to look at all of that content that exists and provide you with some kind of more useful arrangement of it for you. And I think early on that was not a terrible experience. There was a lot of posts. We were not used to dealing with such an overflow of information and curating it for ourselves. But I think now, getting toward the late 2010s into the 2020s now, the feeds have become so algorithmic and so automated and so filled by recommendation that they almost don't make sense anymore. I mean, my day-to-day experience on Instagram is the most confusing to me, because I feel like I don't know what I'm going to get when I open the app. And I don't know that it will stay the same from day to day. Like, one day I might get tons of architecture imagery, and I'll think that's cool, like it's fun to see that. And then the next day I'll just get totally generic Facebook style updates that I don't know where they come from, and I don't know why I'm seeing them. So it just became incoherent. Like, I think there was a coherence to that early sense of Facebook as a place for your friends and family. There was a context there. And the company itself has gradually erased that context and replaced it with this confusingly algorithmic mixture of mostly garbage.
Hay un episodio de la serie...
There's an episode on the TV show The Twilight Zone where a small kid has powers in a small village, supernatural powers, and all the inhabitants of the village try to please him at every moment, because otherwise he can kill them. So they live as slaves because, well, he has conundrums, and he's against the way he does things. So for the media, Facebook algorithm is a little bit like that. I mean, we are like slaves by something that we can't understand, but that has power on us. Empires have surrendered because of trying to try to understand the algorithm, and Facebook changed the algorithm, and then they disappeared.
Yeah, I think as we are both journalists, we both are working in the media, and the media has been affected so much by algorithmic feeds and the replacement of publications by social media. It really feels like that kind of uncaring deity, or like the kid who you don't understand what they want, but you have to appease them. Like, as a writer, you really do feel like you have to write to the algorithm. You have to write to fit into a digital platform. And you end up judging your success by how many likes you get on Twitter, unfortunately. And I definitely judged my own success by that for a long time. And it doesn't work well in the long run, as we've discovered, because the social networks, ultimately, their only goal is getting and keeping your attention.
Yes.
Like, they only care about the engagement. The algorithm only takes into account that engagement. Whereas hopefully what we're trying to do as writers or as publications is not just drive clicks and get people to look at something, but instead communicate a meaningful message and curate something that produces good culture and supports good voices and moves things forward. So I kind of feel like we've reached the brick wall of algorithmic distribution. And I mean, in the media industry particularly, media continues to be on a downward slope, and yet users are getting more and more frustrated with social media. And so I think it's a real conundrum right now. Like, do you keep trying to adapt to the algorithm? Do you keep trying to push your content through these channels, or do you just totally give up and build a new structure that works better for people? But that's so hard because there are so many billions of people on social media.
Sí, es como la comida basura.
Yeah, it's like junk food. I mean, junk food has been created like that because of a reason. It has been created like that for you to like it, to attract your attention, to be striking, but you know that it's not good for you. So do you think that maybe creativity, the real creativity, is at risk right now? Or maybe the industry is fostering hamburgers, and maybe we have forgotten about nouvelle cuisine?
Yeah. I mean, I think the goal of social media was to just drive these clicks and like create the junk food version of content. And I mean, TikTok is really good at producing junk food or encouraging its users to produce the junk food for it. It seems like the level of content has gotten lower and lower and lower over time. In the 2010s, at some point, we had this idea that Twitter was a great discourse engine for the whole world, and it would somehow bring about global democracy and allow, freedom of the press everywhere. That absolutely did not happen. And now the kinds of content that we're consuming because of algorithmic feeds are videos on TikTok of like ASMR content, which I'm not sure if everyone's familiar, but it's kind of audio-visual stimulus. And the weirdest ones I've seen are videos of big bowls of liquid, like water, with wooden balls floating in them, and someone just stirring the balls around and making weird sounds with them. And that's the level of cultural stimulus that we're getting right now. And that's a pretty bleak, ground to hit. So I hope, maybe it's that the conditions don't foster innovation in the same way. The algorithmic feed doesn't reward innovation like a chef making a new dish. Instead, it rewards better and better junk food. Like, junk food is designed to appeal directly to your senses and reward the kind of basest impulses of our taste buds, in the same way that so much content is designed to appeal to the most basic level of our brains, like the most thoughtless, meaningless level. And I hope we have higher aspirations than that.
Sí, porque la cultura que crea...
Yeah, because the culture that is created by the algorithm, by definition, is inoffensive. It wants you to feel better. And big art, well, sometimes its mission is to grab you and to shake you, to make you think, to take you out of your comfort zone. And Filter World wants us to live in a great comfort zone. And sometimes this comfort is good. It doesn't have to be something necessarily bad. And there are people that have got used to it, that maybe we are forgetting that the function that art has is not to make us feel good, but just the opposite.
I think art should make us uncomfortable, or at least not all art has to make us uncomfortable. Like, entertainment is great, dumb movies are great, but I think the pieces of art that we value the most, and the ones that have made it into like a canon of human civilization, are not the ones that made the most people the most comfortable. And yet that's the metric that the algorithm uses. Like, whatever the most people have hit the like button on to the algorithmic feed is the best. In this context, I often think of Moby Dick, the novel, which in its time I think sold something like under 100 copies. Like, it was in social media terms, it absolutely would not have survived at all, and yet today we value it as a cornerstone of literature. So I often think of what the art that we value is not what the algorithmic feed prioritizes. And so if that art is totally choked of oxygen, if it's not allowed to reach people, then we're not going to get those kinds of masterpieces or achievements of human culture. Like, we'll be all oriented toward that junk food. And I think on the other level, like, as consumers, we've gotten used to that state of passive entertainment and things being more and more ambient. So we're less tolerant of being uncomfortable. We are more likely to just, when we feel uncomfortable or shocked by something, we flip to the next piece of content.
Claro, eso crea...
Yeah, this creates another problem. Melville went to the grave thinking that Moby Dick had been a total failure. But the Nobel was there, and time after, it was able to get to the big audience. It was rescued by the critics, and it's one of the great masterpieces in literature. But with algorithms, maybe we don't have the possibilities for this to happen, because there's nothing left. I mean, everything goes so fast that if you're swimming counter current, you won't get to the audience, and there won't be a re-evaluation because nobody will discover you. People can't get to your piece of work.
There's so much ephemerality right now, and not just in terms of what people pay attention to, and just how long a particular piece of culture or artwork lasts. I mean, even in the publishing industry, I think American publishers say maybe you get 2 weeks of attention when you put a book out, and then it's swept away. But on TikTok, your video has 10 minutes to achieve an effect, and if it doesn't achieve that effect in the first 10 minutes of its lifetime, it's erased forever. So I do worry about that ephemerality and for the survival of more complicated artworks. And I think, the internet has only been a mainstream thing for maybe 20 years or so. And we're already seeing how ephemeral it actually is. The kinds of websites and the experiences that I had as a kid on the internet in 1997 are now impossible to experience. And it's just so striking to me, because we can see a painting painted in 1935 and see it in the same way that it was presented then, but we can't see the same digital experience ever again. And then some digital artists have been working against that, interestingly. There are emulators that copy what YouTube looked like in 2009 to recreate a piece of art, and that's what gives the piece of art its meaning. But for so many things, that doesn't exist. And if you don't hit the mark right away, you run the risk of just totally disappearing forever.
Al hilo de esto, existe.
So according to this, we have the feeling that the internet is dead right now. It's a dead internet, and people want to go back to that internet from 20 years ago because it was alive. It hadn't been colonized by the algorithm, and it was more colorful, and it had more personality. Do you think that the revolution in this case, or possible revolution against filter world, cultural revolutions always start because people get bored. In this case, they are getting bored of the dead internet.
People are definitely getting bored and tired of this current state of affairs. And I think you can see their behavior changing somewhat. After publishing this book and doing a lot of events and talking to a lot of people, the boredom and anger is palpable. Everyone is really frustrated. Everyone is really hungry for something else. Just a kind of internet that works differently, that offers different experiences. And I think if the user behavior starts to shift, then that's what starts the revolution in coming. If people move off these platforms en masse, then eventually things will change. But I worry that structurally change is prevented right now because Meta, Google, TikTok just take up all of the resources in technology. It's striking how if a startup invents something new or innovates online, that startup will get acquired by one of these companies and destroyed. Sometimes capitalism says competition breeds innovation, right? If there's more capitalism, then more innovative things will be produced. In this case, we see that actively being prevented by these companies in a way that's just strikingly obvious. And I think that's one of the big reasons why we're not seeing more new experiences, why even though people are alienated and angry about the situation, there's nowhere for them to go. Yeah. So what are we left to do? Maybe this is why people are nostalgic for the early internet as well, because at least when you had a blogspot URL, you could reliably post message and know that some other people would see it who care about it. Whereas now, if you post on Instagram, you have no idea who sees it.
Es interesante porque, bueno, eso significa...
It's interesting because this means that the revolution, the initiative, has to come from us. And you took the initiative, you made a digital cleaning, so to speak. So how did you do it? Because many people have tried just to clean one social media, Twitter, for example, when it became into X because of Elon Musk, and we have not been able, but you cleaned all of them. How was that experience? Sorry.
That I did that algorithm cleanse, I think, in the last few months of writing the book, and I could only get off all of them because I didn't have to be on there. Like as I was writing the book, I could just focus on doing that, and so it almost gave me the freedom to not be on Twitter, to not look at Instagram. But it was really hard for me to do. I mean, I'm sure, like you, have been accustomed for a decade or more to being on Twitter and looking at thousands of posts a day from, my community of writers or the media industry. And suddenly that waterfall of content was totally cut off. And it kind of felt like a silence. Like I was suddenly in the dark or in outer space and no one was talking to me. But I did get off all algorithmic recommendations, and I found that I had to discover new ways of finding culture. Like I could no longer rely on a feed or a recommendation delivering interesting stuff to me. So instead I had to go look for it myself. And this is, it might be an obvious thing to say, but we used to look for things more. Like when you had to go to a CD store to buy a CD and listen to an album, you had to browse the shelves and look at the covers and think for yourself about what you might want to listen to. Whereas in the algorithmic era, we have this option of just total passivity and allowing our consumption to be directed by recommendations. So I think in that algorithm cleanse, it took me 3 or 4 weeks to fully recover in a way, or to get over the withdrawal from social media. But then after that, those first few weeks, I felt calmer in a way. I felt less distracted by what was going on the internet. And it made me realize in a new way how much Twitter didn't matter. Like once you log off, these websites don't have so much of a grip on you, even though logging off feels so hard.
Pierden ese poder sobre.
So they lose this power on you. So filter world won't stop, the algorithms won't stop because they are intrinsically combined to capitalism. Capitalism will never stop. So maybe it needs to come from us. I mean, maybe we have to make up new initiatives in order not to destroy the algorithm, because that's impossible, but to reach to some kind of negotiation and to live in a post-algorithm world. And you speak about the slow food. So how do you think that the slow food can help us come over this stage of total dependency that we have?
I think this is my favorite metaphor for the future so far. Hopefully you'll bear with me. But it's the slow food movement was a way to recognize the source of food, right? It was a way to connect the farmer who grows the food or raises the animals to the restaurant that delivers the food to your plate. So in this metaphor, the farmer is us, or the farmer is the musician or the painter or the photographer or writer, who is the farmer of content. And the restaurant at the other end is the social network that's delivering it to you. And right now there's a huge gulf between those two things. We don't really think about the process by which the content gets from its creator to our screens. And it turns out that process is really bad. Like the algorithmic ecosystem that I describe in the book is not good for that end product. So I think a slow food movement for culture would entail understanding how your content or your culture gets from its creator to you. and trying to build a more direct connection between those two things. And I think you can do that now. There are digital platforms and websites that are better for the production of culture and better for artists and writers than TikTok and Instagram and Facebook have been. I mean, it's not hard to be better than them. But these are sites like Bandcamp, which allows musicians to sell digital music to their listeners directly, or a service like Patreon, which is set up for content subscriptions, or Substack for email newsletters in a similar way. And I think those things kind of cut out the middleman in the same way that like a farm-to-table restaurant cuts out the middleman. Like if the restaurant is farming the ingredients, then you can be pretty sure that they know what's going into them. So you want to go to the sources of your culture and be as close to them as possible. And if possible, pay them directly. Like I think there was this deal that we all made with social media that it would be free, we wouldn't have to make that many sacrifices, we could just get an avalanche of stuff in front of us, and essentially advertising would fund it. Like there would be enough advertising revenue that somehow everyone would survive. That has not worked out very well. So I do think we have to change our behavior a little bit and go back to that earlier exchange where we just paid someone to do what we wanted them to do. Whether it's a musician or a ceramicist making bowls or a filmmaker. I think the more direct the exchange is, the more sustainable it is and the healthier it is. And hopefully it builds better incentives for culture than the algorithmic platforms have.
Entonces, ¿te consideras optimista?
So, do you consider yourself as optimistic? I mean, it's going to be a long process, but are you optimistic? Do you think that we will win this battle?
I am optimistic. I think you can never stop culture or art, like as algorithmic as things have become, as boring and ambient as they often seem to be, there are always artists making interesting things. They're just having a hard time getting heard and making their careers sustainable. So I'm optimistic for the source of culture because I think artists will always do cool things. And I'm optimistic that the environment of the internet is changing. Like the ecosystem is moving toward a new state or a new design, partly because of those direct to consumer platforms, and partly just because I think people are recognizing how much algorithms have manipulated them and are feeling that boredom and ennui and moving away on their own. I think if you had asked me when I started writing this book like 5 years ago or whatever, I was actually less optimistic then. So in writing the book and seeing how things have shifted in that time, I actually feel more optimistic than ever.
Y en uno de los...
And one of the best examples that sometimes we need to get out of the known path and to explore places outside because they can surprise us. You wrote a great part of this book at a coffee shop, but it's not a coffee shop like the ones that we've mentioned before. It's different. What was that experience like?
Yeah, I wrote a lot of this book in a cafe by my home in Washington, D.C. And there is an old basilica, like a super huge church that was in the neighborhood that had been empty for a long time. And a hotel took it over. A kind of generic hotel that has locations in LA and San Francisco and DC, I think. But they renovated it into this state of like high generic minimalism. And it's a really beautiful space. And so I would walk there, most days. I would go to the coffee shop, sit down and try to write my 1,000 words a day and gradually form them into this book. But I found the space inspiring. Like that was a muse in a way, because I could meditate on the kind of generic design of this space, but also think about how aesthetics had changed over time, and like the architecture, the fundamental architecture was still there. There was this huge ceiling hundreds of feet in the air, And it was like a testament to creativity and reuse that this space had just kept providing things to people and kept changing over time. But it was also, I mean, I think cafes are also social networks of their own. Like, they're gathering places for people. They're spaces in which we observe what other people are doing, what coffee they're drinking, what books they're reading, how they're dressed. And so I think that atmosphere was really good for me too. Like, I prefer writing in public. Like, I think I need that peer pressure of other people doing things and maybe noticing if I'm being lazy. But it was so interesting to always be in that space and see how people flowed through it and kind of watch contemporary culture express itself in that physical space where there happened to be this confluence of people. So it was maybe more inspiring than I thought it was, but it truly, like, that's the patron saint of this book.
Fantástico.
Amazing. So, if this was a Facebook post, now it is time to see the comments. So if you want to ask any question to Kyle, you have a great chance to do it. So please feel free.
Thank you very much. Very interesting, your opinion. I think the word is laziness, switch off, because people are so used to receive instead of doing. Then moving around, if you walk in the Gran Via, is similar to some other streets in America or in Europe, but a few streets ahead, there is another world. So why not switch off, just discover, explore, and so on. And it's not necessary to be so passive and receive things, instead do things. I want to know your opinion, if it's like this or not.
Yeah, totally. I think, especially when I travel, actually, I do let my phone dictate a lot of where I'm walking. Like, as I'm walking around Madrid, I am also looking at Google Maps and, like, seeing what algorithmic recommendations are on there. And I think that is bad. Like, it really helps me navigate because I have no sense of direction whatsoever. But there is a world that exists as soon as you put your phone down and as soon as you close that app. Like, the phone discourages us from literally just looking around and looking at a restaurant or a cafe and just deciding to walk in of our own accord. I'm sure a lot of us are guilty of looking up a restaurant and seeing what the star rating is before we decide to go into it. And we kind of have to throw away that judgment a little bit and just embrace the randomness that happens when you're just walking down the street. Like, I think that the internet is kind of a metaphorical city of its own, right? I think the algorithmic feed is like a giant highway running through the city. Like, it brings you places really fast, but it's only going in one direction. And as soon as you get off that main highway, you can find your way into much more interesting spaces.
Even though it's Taco Bell to Taco Bell.
Hi, thank you. You make a good match, I think.
Thank you.
So I was wondering if you made a pact or something, because you managed to not mention the magic word AI in the entire conversation. So this can only be deliberate. But I was wondering, so some people think this AI model, new world, is an actual new world. And some others, from the second camp, think this is the culmination of the filter world. So I was wondering, what's your opinion on that?
I do think it's the culmination of filter world. My theory lately has been that algorithmic feeds encouraged artists to make generic stuff. Like, the algorithmic feed pressures people to conform to an average standard. And so that produced a kind of generic culture of its own accord. But now with AI, it just produces the generic culture itself immediately. So you can push the button or describe what you want, push the button, and it'll spit out the archetypes, the average tropes, kind of the lowest common denominator of the culture that you describe. So yeah, I think AI can't in any way escape the problem of averages because it is an averaging machine. Like the way that AI works is it takes in all of the data and finds patterns and tropes and associations and then reproduces them. Like I don't think AI can have an original innovation or produce original culture in any way. But that's not to say that artists can't use it as a tool. Like I feel still optimistic about art and artists because they will look at this tool and find a way to bring it to a new place and make interesting things with it. But I do worry, like I've talked to people who use image generators for fun and for their own enjoyment, and they feel like that is a form of art making for them. But the kinds of imagery they usually make is like, what if Spider-Man was in Star Wars? And that's the kind of culture that gets produced by these machines. So I worry a bit that like the ability to generate AI art will distract people from actual human artists, which would be bad.
¿Alguien más?
Anybody else? Yep.
So during your research, meanwhile you were writing your book, did you manage to find any insight about what or how all this started? So how we moved from an internet, when a heavily curated internet, when we were developing personal blogs and even the primitive social media like MySpace were heavily curated. What was the starting point, or what made all this started? Do you manage to see any of that meanwhile you were preparing this book?
Yeah, let me know if I understand correctly, but are you asking at what point it kind of moved from this person-to-person curated internet to a more algorithmic one?
Not exactly when, but
Yeah, why did that change happen, or what motivated it? I think my starting point for that was I noticed that there was this moment in 2015 or 2016 that all of these platforms made the decision to become more algorithmic. So around those years, Instagram became more driven by recommendations. The Netflix homepage did more recommendations. The Facebook feed changed. And I mean, I think that was the consequence of some groupthink among those social platforms. Like as soon as one did it and it worked out okay, the rest could do it. And you see that with AI right now. But I also think it's a consequence of the maturation of the internet and just the fact that there was more and more and more content. Like in my personal experience, there was a palpable change from when you had 200 friends on Facebook who were all people you knew to when you had 5,000 random connections on Facebook and it no longer had this coherent meaning. So when you had those 5,000 connections, your feed no longer made sense if you just looked at it in a chronological way, because there's too many people, too many accounts posting too much random stuff. So at that point, the algorithmic filter became more necessary, because if the platform didn't filter the content, then you would log on, see nothing interesting, and then log off, and that would be really bad for them. So I think it was that moment of algorithmicification, or whatever you want to call it, was essentially motivated by the overproduction of content, which was encouraged by the platforms themselves. So because we were all posting so much all the time, because suddenly everyone felt the pressure to be on social media and to make themselves public, then it became necessary to aggressively filter what you were going to see. And that process, I mean, I'm surprised that process has just kept going. Like the great innovation of TikTok circa 2018 was to say, no, users don't actually want to choose what to follow at all. They just want to be passive. They don't want the labor of curating their own feed. And it turned out that was true for a lot of people. And so now more and more social networks are doing that. Like they don't even care who you follow. They're just going to show you what they want to show you.
¿Tenemos a alguien más?
So, anybody else?
Vale.
Writing about technology and publishing books feels old-fashioned in the best case scenario. I mean, to me, it feels like trying to send a message by using pigeons. You know, I mean, all the ways that you can convey any message. Writing a book, old-fashioned way, printed books. Mm-hmm. Is it because it creates this sort of conversation you want to have? Or, I don't know, I've always, you know, with the internet, writing books feels like a statement itself. Mm-hmm. So could you talk about that? I mean, because from the outset it looks like a little bit, you know, funny in the best way.
Yeah, I've been thinking through that dilemma lately. Like, at least in the United States, it seems like more and more people are consuming content or getting new ideas from podcasts or from audio experiences. So it's like, if your only goal is to reach people and talk to people, why not just make a podcast of your idea? But I mean, I think reading is the best way of consuming ideas. Like, I would say that as a writer, but I think writing is the most complicated form of communication. It's static, it's designed intentionally in the way that it is on the page. It's a permanent document of someone's thought and like the arduous process of assembling writing into a whole book. So I mean, at least for me, I wrote because, I mean, I'm a writer, and I wrote because writing was a great way to make a permanent record of all these things and to just think through my own thoughts about them. But then I think having the book published and like going through that process and having events and stuff, a book is a cultural symbol that still holds a ton of power. Like that physical object, the stack of books somewhere, the book on your shelf at home, like, it has a real weight still. And it has a way of sparking a public conversation in a way that a podcast doesn't, in a way that a YouTube channel doesn't. So it's almost, a book is still this totem in a way, and it causes a lot of people to pay attention, and it sparks this public discussion of what the book is about. And that happens through reviews and journalism and podcasts, you know, interview podcasts that I did. So I suppose, I guess, a book is just is still the best way to spark that public debate about something. And hopefully that remains true for a while, but who knows?
I think there's a lot of talking about interaction and about convenience, like how digital platforms offer convenient ways to consume things and to access things. But for me, the key word is friction. Mm-hmm. Like, friction is the thing that we avoid all the time. And when you were describing what happened when you decided to basically quit digital platforms for a while, you were describing things that have a lot of friction, like finding your own way around a record store, or even reading a book that might even trigger your own thoughts, which is a form of friction that we fight with every day. So as an artist, as a writer, how do you think about ways in which the friction you produce with your own work can be pushed into the masses?
Yeah, forcing friction on people. Yeah. Friction was a theme that only emerged like as I was finishing the book, I think. Like, it's very latent in the book, but it's such a powerful idea right now. and people don't talk about it enough. Because the social networks, the digital platforms are designed to be frictionless. They're designed to discourage you from ever stopping, from ever thinking twice. Like, they just, you want to stay in the feed and continue in this flow state of consuming content. And I think friction allows you to stop and think about something more, and it slows down your digestion of that thing in a way. Maybe it helps it stick in your brain more, rather than you just flipping to the next thing in your feed. So, I mean, a book is a really high friction cultural object, to be very clinical. Like, a movie is not very friction heavy. You sit there and watch it for 2 hours. A book, you ideally sit there and turn every page and spend, many hours with my thoughts, which sounds self-aggrandizing, actually. But yeah, I mean, a book is a good way to put that friction into the world. And if someone truly wants to contend with it, then they have to read the book and think through the thoughts that I put in the book. But I'd be curious to think of more ways that you can have friction-heavy experiences now. When I think a museum exhibition is fairly friction-heavy if you go through and think about every object and think about the curation and the arrangement of everything as a whole. Fashion to me feels very frictionless right now. Like, you hit a button on Amazon or Depop or whatever, and you immediately get this object, and then you consume it, and then the trend might be over a week later, and that's been very frictionless. But now I'm just riffing now, so.
Tenemos una pregunta ahí al fondo.
So we have one question at the back row.
Sí.
Buenas tardes.
So good afternoon. Gutenberg and the printing machine revolutionized the way the culture was conveyed. But at the same time that the books were conveyed in a global way, on the other hand, there were some forces that were not interested in the fact that this culture was all around the world, and in the libraries of the world they created that so-called hell. The hell was where the books were stored, the books that were in the index that could not be read, or maybe only a few people could read them. So in World Filter, do we have a hell?
Like, hell is in a place where everything bad is kept and things can't be paid attention to, I suppose. It's a good question. I mean, I think too many things in Filter World get cast off into that hell. Like, the algorithms kind of put a soft ban on a lot of culture. It's not that it's inaccessible, but it's just more difficult to access, and you're kind of discouraged from going off the path that you're on. So I feel like the culture that gets forgotten about or missed in Filter World is the more complicated stuff, or the more ambiguous things, or the more aesthetically challenging. Like, I often think about like the performance of The Rite of Spring when the audience rioted because they were so shocked by this piece of music. Or another similar thing happened with Steve Reich's piece, Four Organs, maybe, which is this aggressively minimalist piece of music that eventually the audience just rebelled against. So I think that kind of culture is like cast off and ignored in favor of stuff that's really easily appealing and that kind of like normal song that got popular on Spotify. So I think things that are not normal or are not normalized are pushed off into that unreachable area. I'm not sure if I answered your question well, but
en el infierno no solo...
So in the hell, we didn't only see the piece of work that put the system in danger, but, well, books that we all know that are masterpieces of literature, but because of some reason, in that moment, maybe the church or the political powers were not interested in these pieces of work to circulate. So do we have the equivalent in the sense that there's a hidden power that is interested in not allowing some works to circulate, and maybe these works would be at this library that is difficult to access?
I'm not sure it's a conscious or intentional ban in the way that like the church would ban a particular piece of literature. But I do think all of this is a consequence of Silicon Valley companies not really caring about culture, such as it is. Like, Daniel Ek, the CEO of Spotify, is particularly infamous for not caring about the music that's on his platform. And he once made this infamous statement that musicians should no longer only put out an album every 2 or 3 years. They need to be always putting out new music all the time, because that's what's good for Spotify. So I think that kind of ideology pushes the more complicated culture to the side and doesn't allow artists to create in the way that they might organically want to. Like if Spotify is kind of softly discouraging musicians from only putting something out when they have something to say and instead forcing them to just make more and more and more music, then we're going to lose that kind of more creative music or more singular music. But there's also, I mean, in a more literal sense, social networks do moderate content and they do ban certain keywords or imagery. And some of that is good. I mean, we don't want, you know, inappropriate content on social networks. But particularly in the case of TikTok, there, at one point, the parent company of TikTok made a mandate that there should be less ugly people in the feed. Like, the feed should have more attractive people in it only. And certainly that's a way of banning or moderating what people have access to.
So that's why my TikTok never took off. ¿Tenemos alguna pregunta?
So do we have any further questions?
Very much for sharing Filter World with us. That was terrific and so much fun.
Yeah, so thank you for this conversation, and thank you all for your questions as well.
Ahora, bueno, va a estar allí firmando libros, así que sí, nos vamos todos allí.
Now he'll be signing books there, so you can go there, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you.